Hello and welcome to another episode of the Fantasy Writers Toolshed, and Happy New Year 2021. Wasn't quite sure we'd see 2020 out, to be honest. Dragged,
Good riddance.
but yeah, good riddance to it. 2021 now, let's think forward. And first episode of the year, we've got quite a busy one, and we're doing quite a fun subject as well. We've just been having a chat before we started recording, and we were getting well into it. So it's all about weapons, armor, and ultimately there'll be a second part where we discuss how all this is used and applied in fantasy stories in our writing. So, JM, how did Christmas and New Year treat you?
It was good. It was quiet. Being stuck at home. Even here in Korea, everything's mostly shut down. Even though we don't have a lot of open cases, but been working hard on the publishing side of things. So in December, right now we've got about 8 books either out or pending release from Of Metal and Magic Publishing, and this month we've got big news because this month, actually next week, Tuesday, the 19th of January, we have the first original release from our indie press. And this is J.D. Mankowski's novella, A Wealth of Knowledge. So this is completely new content that has never been seen anywhere. The only people that have read it are me and J.D. because I edited it for him. It's a really, really clean, well-paced, intriguing novella. So that goes on sale on the 19th of January, this Tuesday. Hopefully you'll look into that. And then we've got a big year. 2021 is going to be a big year for us. We've got some momentum now. So my Of Metal and Magic core novel, Call of the Guardian, will be coming out in February, and it's available for pre-release on Amazon. And then your Of Metal and Magic core novel, Prize Lament, comes out in March. And then we've got about 3 more Of Metal and Magic core novels lined up to hit 1 month each after that. We're still working out whose book is going to come when, but there's going to be 1 in April, 1 in May, and 1 in June, amongst other projects that we're working on. So yeah, we've got a lot of momentum. The ball's rolling, and it's very exciting right now.
Yeah, it's tiring to think about it all that work, to be honest.
Yeah.
It's exciting, like you say. So if you want to get involved with any of this, start following us, get some chance to win some freebies. We're currently running a giveaway at the moment to win a very fancy Lord of the Rings box set, along with the Hobbit as well. That's in there. So to enter and join the Of Metal and Magic community, just head over to ofmetalandmagic.wordpress.com and just join the mailing list. That's all you have to do, and you'll be automatically entered into every competition that we do. And we're going to try and do 1 a month, if not 1 every other month.
There's actually 2 giveaways going on. So you got your nice Lord of the Rings box set, and also if you sign up for the newsletter, one of the first newsletters you're going to get is going to have a hidden secret in it that will show you how to join a second giveaway for a copy of our Of Metal and Magic, one of our Of Metal and Magic core anthologies that we had. We have some extra paperbacks for. So 2 giveaways going on right now, not to mention we'll be pushing out free books and sales and all sorts of other things through our newsletter. So yeah, like Richie said, go to ofmetalmagicpublishing.wordpress.com, and there are several places where you'll find where you can sign up for our publishing newsletter and get access to these deals and giveaways and insider information and all that good stuff.
Nice one. So enough of all that. It's time to get stuck in to some fantasy weapons and armor.
Combat. Let's talk combat. So today, what we the topic that we picked out was to look at combat in fantasy, specifically for today, weapons and armor. And I'm approaching this topic more from the perspective of an editor and some of the issues and problems that I've seen with the topic. And Richie is coming at it with just somebody who has just a whole lot of knowledge on medieval warfare, which is relevant because I don't think anybody listening is going to be surprised that a lot of fantasy, maybe most fantasy, takes place in a medieval setting. And a lot of fantasy, if not most fantasy, is very focused on action, fighting, combat, warfare. So looking at these things like weapons and armor and battles is very relevant to a fantasy writer. Even though
Yeah.
it's fantasy, most fantasy that I've read and that I've seen tends to draw heavily on human history, Earth history, especially weapons and things, right? I think human ingenuity is such that if there's a way to kill somebody, we've probably invented it already.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure someone creative will come up with something.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think there's like a natural relationship between the two. Someone comes up with some murderous weapon, someone else comes up with a way to stop them from being killed. So weapons and armor, it's just that sort of ongoing relationship throughout history. Yeah, and it's funny how we'd sort of drawn to the medieval period in fantasy. I suppose it comes from like what Tolkien wrote about. Early fantasy, I suppose, adopted the medieval period as its own.
Definitely because the mythological roots and the roots of fantasy being the past and things like that. Interestingly, fantasy glorifies and fantasizes the medieval period as this golden age, right? But you don't get any discussion of things like dysentery and
yeah, it's terrible.
where do they go to the bathroom?
I have like an average age of like 30 years old, you know what I mean? Imagine being 15
like life
years old and
expectancy.
being 15 years old and being in your midlife.
What's wrong with you, little Tommy? I'm having a midlife crisis.
Yeah, in middle age when you have puberty. It's just
All downhill from here.
yeah, it's like if you think about like topical like viruses at the moment, the plague that like absolutely decimated people, like decimated the whole population, and the knock-on effects were incredible because it completely changed the social standing of peasants, because all of a sudden there was a great demand for peasants to work on farms, but there wasn't any, so they could negotiate better prices, and that created that sort of working class. So it's amazing how that affected like sort of came out of it in the end. But
I think part of the appeal of the medieval setting is related to combat, and it's
yeah,
related to the technology of the time and the intimacy of the combat, right? Melee
yeah,
weapons, swords and shields, you're right next to somebody. It's very different than combat by gun or combat by drone,
yeah.
that we
It's
have
more
today.
heroic.
Sci-fi battles are a different creature than a fantasy fight scene where your character is right next to the person trying to kill them. And that might be
Yeah,
why a lot of like 80s and 90s, like even today, action films always end with a fist fight, right? These guys are running
it's more
around.
dramatic. Yeah,
Yeah, they're
you
running
can
around
draw
shooting
the
each
action
other,
out.
blowing
Yeah,
things up, and then they toss their guns and they get into an honorable fist fight.
yeah, yeah, and it's amazing how many punches they can take. So, but yeah, it's exactly that. It's I think it's the glory, isn't it? It's a sword fight or like facing someone in hand-to-hand combat. It's like life or death there, and there's I don't know, there's a sort of glory to it, isn't it? And or a courageousness that like you it's different if you've got a bow or a gun and you can just pick someone off. But a sort of battle for your life.
It
It's
was a wake
it's
up
different,
call
isn't it?
in World War One, right? It was like a wake up call. It was a totally different animal to be in a trench and so your buddy suddenly gets shot and you don't know where it came from. You can't
Yeah,
see your enemy. Like there's no there was no honor in that. It was it wasn't what people were expecting war to be. It
yeah.
changed.
And I think what I haven't really seen this in fantasy, but I know it's been toned down a lot by publishers because I was also toned down by publishers when I was writing a fantasy. Um, but medieval warfare was absolutely brutal. Can you really imagine hacking someone to death with a sword? I mean, I could when it comes to fantasy and thinking about the past and like you hear about battles played out, like all thousands of people died. They just sort of because it's the past, you just think of them as numbers. Really, you don't really appreciate the individual horrors that people witnessed and went through. It's just like absolutely brutal. You wearing a helmet, you can't see anything around you. Your hearing's stifled. You can't really hear what's going on. That's why, like the Romans, the Greeks, they all used to wear plumes on the helmets because when you're in the midst of a struggle, like a shield war, for example, you have shoulder to shoulder, you can't move, you can't really do anything at all. Um, you just look for the plume of your leader and just follow them. And that's all you do. So it's just absolute. I couldn't. I don't think I could do medieval warfare. I'd have been an archer or something like that. I just sort of hovered in the background, just fired a few arrows. Not getting on the front line. Someone else can do that. But yeah, it's absolutely brutal. But some weapons then that in fantasy that we see, like medieval weapons anyway, there's some common ones. Obviously, the sword. There's always like the enchanted sword. Probably comes from Excalibur. It's like probably the oldest example of an enchanted fantasy sword. Um, but like if you think all through fantasy, there's magical weapons like Lord of the Rings. You had Sting, elf, elf, elven sword glows, doesn't it, when there's orcs around? That's a nice little enchantment there.
I think it's actually Sting is actually a dagger. It's just a sword because a hobbit's holding it.
Yeah, there we go then. Yeah, but yeah, there's all different kinds of things like that. What were your favorite fantasy weapons? Like, there's for me, I'll tell you after you've told me what yours is. But for me, there's like fantasy weapons. It's part of why you love it. You know what I mean? Why you fall in love with it. It's the creativity of the weapon, I think, of what it can do.
It's hard to get away from the sword because the sword has been just such an integral part of fantasy and mythology and history. And we'll talk about swords later. Um, the lightsaber because
Ah, yeah.
I'm obsessed with the idea that Star Wars is
Ah,
fantasy.
it's amazing. It's amazing. The
But
lightsaber.
all lightsaber is a sword. It's the same exact fantasy symbol that you find in other fantasy. It's just spacified.
Yeah.
Um, trying to think of something really unique. Um, the so Greek mythology, the trident. So
Yeah.
um, tridents, I guess, can be used as weapons, but especially against armor, they don't seem very practical. But you,
You'd
but
look a bit of a joke on the battlefield if you
yeah,
rocked up with a trident. Everyone's standing there with
um,
the axes and the swords.
a war trident maybe that's curved for hooking or something could be useful. But I think not only Poseidon
Yeah.
and his trident, but I think there was in the Greek, in like Homer, like there was at least one or more heroes that used tridents.
Oh yeah,
Um,
I'm sure someone's used tridents in a battle before.
but it's like a pitchfork, right? And you're like,
Yeah, I suppose
A
it's
lot of
like
lot of
before.
lot of medieval weapons are just like what's on the farm. Grab something.
Yeah,
Go.
that's
So
exactly.
pitchfork and spear. Pikes and hose and whatever else you can, sickles, whatever you can grab.
Yeah, definitely like that. That's a great point to make. Especially something when you're thinking about your own stories and like particularly world building in particular. Um, so particular twice there. World building in particular. Um, these weapons were the only the sort of ones available to people. So like flails, that was a good one. So you'd use a flail to, like I think it was cut wheat down, which is basically it's just a stick with a chain and like a heavy, shorter stick attached to it. But you could swing that around. You could kill someone with that, like pretty easy. Sickles, like you said. Um,
So what's your
fork.
favorite? What's your favorite fantasy weapon?
Fantasy weapons for me. I always go back to Final Fantasy VII because this is like one of my early sort of obsessions with something fantasy related. I think it was about 9 or 10, and the weapons in that game were absolutely ridiculous. But you didn't care when you were playing it. It was just amazing. So the main character, Cloud, he had this absolutely huge meat cleaver like sword, which he just carried around on his back. Yeah, don't think they really cared about the logistics behind it. It didn't really matter either. So that was cool. But I Sephiroth, the main antagonist in that, like he as a bad guy, I don't know what it was because I was so young when I played that game. I just remember how I feel, and he always stuck with me as like an incredible villain and like one of the ultimate villains. And his sword was just like this long katana type thing, but it was much more slender and more like a broadsword, like a curved broadsword, like a
But
something like
yeah,
that. It was
much
weird.
much longer than a great
Yeah.
in a regular
Again,
Japanese great.
massively improbable. Really, I don't know if we could craft something like that, but yeah, it just stuck with me. Amazing. So that does set it up fantasy weapons apart, like especially having enchantments as well. Um, I remember Raymond Feist, a character called Thomas. He had an enchanted set of armor, and he also had an enchanted sword as well. And that sort of took him over completely, like, and he ended up becoming a different character. But yeah, brilliant. Like just
Inheritance is a, not to get off topic, but inheritance is a good point as well, because in the medieval age, like most people didn't have money to just go. It's not like Dungeons and Dragons. Hey, you start with 50 gold pieces and buy yourself some gear. Like most people didn't have money to go buy out a new suit of armor or a new weapon. They were handed down in families. You see that in
yeah,
Mulan, the new Mulan film. She takes her father's armor and sword, and they're these very potent symbolic images of the family.
yeah, that's cool.
So moving on to the topic at hand. My intent with this topic is to come at it from an editor's point of view and look at some of the issues that I've seen with other writers. And it's important that when you're writing about real world historical weapons, that you understand what they are and what their uses were and what their capabilities are. There's a lot of young writers that their experience with fantasy and history comes from, and this isn't meant to be derogatory, but comes from video games, comes from tabletop RPGs like Dungeons and Dragons, comes from bad movies. It's important to do your research. It's important to know the difference between different weapons and what they can actually do, what they were actually used for, to make your work seem a little bit more authentic. So the basic example that I can give you is the difference between a knife and a dagger. What do you think the difference between a knife and a dagger would be, Richie? Other than technically speaking, a dagger is a type of knife, but generally speaking, what would you say the difference between a knife and a dagger is?
Say a dagger's a bit bigger than a knife.
So a knife is a tool and a dagger is a weapon. So because they serve different uses, they're designed differently. Typically, a knife, like a hunting knife, is going to have an edge on one side and a rounded tip. They're used for slashing. They're used for cutting meat. A dagger is a self-defense weapon, uh, usually a secondary weapon, right? And a dagger is going to be typically edged on both sides with a point. Daggers are used for thrusting typically. So when an archer gets overrun, he needs something that he can quickly, get out of a bad situation with by jabbing somebody with a weapon. That's usually a dagger. So something like a dirk or a stiletto. It's going to be a dagger is typically slender, edged on both sides with a point for stabbing, whereas a knife is often broader, blunter, with a edge on one side and is used for slashing. So they're not really, the words aren't really interchangeable. They're used for different things. If you're talking about a combat weapon, you probably should be using the word dagger. If you're talking about a hunter who has a knife that they use for skinning animals and they just happen to use it in combat, then you want to use the word knife to convey that this isn't typically a weapon. So those are kind of the things that I think of when I'm editing a manuscript and looking at these sorts of things. What other types of weapons are there out there? I know you have a lot of knowledge on different types of weapons.
Me personally, my favorite weapon is a bill hook. So the reason I like a bill hook is it's essentially three weapons in one. So if anyone who doesn't know what a bill hook is, it's like a spear, but the end, rather than just having a sort of a spearhead, it also has a sharp and short point, pointing out where in one direction, and then a sort of like a scimitar like blade on the other side. Um, some of them do tend to have more of a hook, and the reason for that is um, bill hooks were used like sort of on the front line instead of spears. So if you come up against a shield wall, one way to sort of knock them off balance, I suppose, is to hook onto the shields in the shield wall and pull them back. Or and benefit of this then, as soon as you pull someone back, you pull them forward off balance, and then you can thrust forward with the spike and get them in the face. You know what I mean? So that would be very pleasant. So it just gives you, it's got so much versatility. It's light enough to use with a shield as well. So bill hooks were quite commonly used, but they're not seen very often in fantasy.
So
So
that would we were talking before we started. That would fall into a category of something called pole. At least in American English, we call pole arms.
yeah, so like spears as well. Spears throughout history have been one of the most commonly used weapons just because they're easy to make. It's just a pole of wood with a spearhead on top. It doesn't have to be, you could just use the wood, sharpen the wood. You could add some flint on there, iron, bronze, steel, whatever you want. But
So
you can still
typically,
kill.
typically speaking, a spear. So if you just sharpen the end of a pole, then you're working with a pike. And if
Yeah,
you attach some sort of metal head or blade to the end, then you're dealing with a spear.
yeah, there you go. So one of the most famous sort of tactical formations, I suppose, was the phalanx with the spear that was used by the ancient Greeks. And it was just basically like a big square hedgehog, and the spears that they used were incredibly long. Some of them like 9, 10 foot long. So it's just really difficult to get past the phalanx. Like it was just like a sort of spiky rock that you just couldn't break down. And part of the reason why they defeated the Persians, and the Persians massively outnumbered them. Really interesting battle. Good book as well. Christine Cameron, Killer of Men series. Check that out. It's fantastic. Other weapons.
Another
Well,
thing,
sorry,
before we
go.
jump to other weapons, another thing that a lot of people don't realize about spears is So your typical spear can be used like a pike just for thrusting, but there's a lot of ancient spears that have a larger blade with sharpened sides that actually can be used for slashing as well. So there's a spear is more than just a poking weapon, depending
Yeah,
on the shape of the blade. And other pole arms like halberds and whatnot can have different shaped blades, can have hooks that are all
yeah,
used for different things.
yeah. So much versatility, and the more you look into it, the more niche weapons that you'll find. Like there's another polearm called the Aalspieß, which is like a German weapon, translates to eel spear, and it was like half sword. It was like a sword with a spear, spear pole, and it just meant that you could do battle from a bit, duel with a swordsman from a bit further away. Don't think it was that common. Don't really hear about it. It was a fad. It was a fad in the 1300s for a while. Um, Another cool weapon that was Warhammer. Again, it just comes from general tools that you find lying around the farm. Big hammer for putting stakes into the ground, things like that. So Warhammers, as we see in sort of combat, they were sort of adapted to be a bit more murderous. So many of them had like a spike at the coming at the back of the actual hammer itself. Um, Many of them were one-handed as well, and you could have a shield with that as well, and you could just particularly effective against plated armor because, as we'll discuss in a little while when we come to armor, it's difficult to overcome defenders who are heavily armored. If you haven't got the right weapons, so if you use a sword, for example, against plated armor, there's a good chance that the sword's going to get stuck in the armor, and then they've got a free shot at you. Nothing you can do. So one way to overcome that was just to bludgeon. So there's a whole sort of like maces as well, which we'll come to in a second. These are all bludgeoning and crushing weapons designed to sort of just hammer their way through heavy armor.
Another very common type of weapon that you find in fantasy are bows. And
Oh yeah,
this is one that I find authors tend to get the technical details wrong with, right? So like a crossbow. Um, Playing a video game, you might be able to shoot a crossbow every 2 seconds. That's not how crossbows work. That's all this needs to be taken with a grain of salt. That in fantasy, you can come up with different ideas to make your weapons work differently. But if you're going to go some way different than how weapons typically historically have worked, you need to describe it well, right? So a
yeah,
crossbow typically was a big bulky thing. You fire your bolt, and then in order to charge it, you have to put it on the ground, stand on it, and pull with both arms. In order to get that a crossbow a lot of big heavy crossbows could penetrate armor, even plate armor. But the reason why you do that is because the draw was so strong, and because it was so strong, you have to pull with two arms in order to lock a crossbow. You put it down on the ground, you stand on it, and you pull with two arms to charge it, or you use some sort of a large cranking device that was not part of the crossbow. It was something you picked up, you cranked your crossbow, you loaded it. It took a long time to load a crossbow. Someone with a crossbow is not going to, they get their shot off and you're 100 yards away, they're not going to get another shot off before you can charge them. The alternative, of course, is a regular bow, which is just a shaft with a string. But these, a straight bow is not anywhere near as strong as a crossbow. You're not going to penetrate armor with a straight bow unless it's really, really huge. So like,
longbows could, and like it depends on the range.
well, with the thing about, longbows, right? So English longbows are 6 feet long or more. They're as tall as the person wielding them.
Yeah,
So that's where all the power comes from, is it's just really, really, really big. you're not going to run through the forest shooting with a longbow. It's just not going to happen. And then a short straight bow is not going to have the power that a longbow is going to get. So you'll find historically short bows like those used by the Mongols and the other horse riding nomads of the steppes are recurve bows, compound recurve bows that use a horn that is glued to the wood and creates a opposite curve that you bend against when you string it. So it has twice the curve of a straight bow, and that's where all the power comes from that allowed those bows to do more damage. Of course you can be, follow the Tolkien route and be like, well, this is a elven made bow of elven wood and it's magical, and but you need to explain that. You can't just take for granted that someone with a straight short bow is going to be able to do a lot of damage. You've got to explain why, because typically that's not how bows work. Same thing with a crossbow. You could come up with some sort of a auto loading or auto cranking mechanism. You just gotta explain that it's there, because normally a crossbow can't fire quickly.
Yeah, I mean, on the crossbow points, some armies actually pair the crossbowman up with a shield. Someone just carried a shield around, and they'd set the shield up in front of the crossbowman while the crossbowman reloaded. So JM mentioned a few like used to crank them. There was a few terms for this. So rack and pinion was one. So this would be like a crank that sat on top of the crossbow, and then another one was windlass, a windlass cranking crossbow, which was at the back of the crossbow, and you just like keep it on the sort of facing the ground with a like a stand, something that you'd stand on, and then just winch it back, the string back. But like bows in particular, I've done a bit of archery last year. The year before now. It's all becoming a blur last year. And I learned so much actually trying it myself. So I think something I always used to write quivers kept on your back. That doesn't work really in a practical sense. The best place to put them and most practical is on your hip, but don't have them pointing backwards because there's a chance they can fall out. So have them pointing forwards, and then they're not going to fall out, and they're there, ready for you to grab. That's a nice little thing I learned. Another little thing as well, when you loose the string snaps forward and strikes your forearm, so it can cut your forearm and like bruise. So you have to wear a van brace to stop that from happening, like a leather van brace, just to catch that. And gloves as well. If you've got to wear like a leather gloves, otherwise the string can snap back and cut your fingers. Little things like that, you know what I mean? When you're writing your stories, they can make the difference because it shows that you know what you're talking about, and you can properly get into the character's mind and their experience and convey that to the reader. And the better you can do that, the better your story is going to be.
It's all just doing your research, like doing your research, understanding if you want, I think my hero should have this type of weapon, or this character should have this type of weapon. You do a little research, figure out where they come from, what they're used for. Another example of a myth that's out there is the rapier. This is something that I had understood for a while, that rapiers were used to penetrate armor. It's a myth. The rapiers actually appeared historically after the emergence of guns, and after the use of heavy plate armor started going away because of the use of guns. So rapiers arrive when people are not using armor because they're stabby weapons, and you can wield them. They give you range, and they became a symbol of gentleman status and aristocracy, and nothing at all to do with penetrating armor. And you can Google it and you can do your research and you can find out things like that. So there's a lot of misconceptions out there based off of film, and video games, and just general uh, chit chatter on the internet. So just do your research, and uh, it'll make your work a little bit more authentic.
Yeah, most
But
definitely.
before we move on to armor, obviously we need to talk about it. What's the obsession with swords in fantasy?
I don't know. I think, like you say, it just seems to be. It's a heroic weapon, a sword, isn't it? Like if you think of Aragorn in Lord of the Rings, like fighting off all the Uruk-hai in at the end of the first film, that's so heroic. It's just like when it's Star Wars as well. You love Star Wars. Like watching like lightsaber fights is pretty cool. It's really gets you going. You know what I mean? There's a lot. It's life or death. Watching people fight life or death. There's something quite engaging about that, and I think that's why people like it.
I think, I mean, a lot of what we do in fantasy is because of what Tolkien did, I think. And Tolkien adopts the sword because the sword was a historical symbol, right? Um, his, Historically speaking, swords have been around for a long time, and the reason why they're so important is um, there's several reasons. One is they are very hard to make compared to other types of weapons. So they were in the early Metal Ages. So like you're talking like Copper and Bronze Ages, swords were symbols of the highest class rank, right? Only the chiefs had swords because they were hard to make. The other thing about a sword is it's a combat weapon. It is not a tool. There's no other use of a sword other than killing people. So it is a symbol of that kind of martial authority that the chief takes with him. You can't say the same thing for like a spear. A spear can be a hunting tool. A knife can be a utilitarian tool. A hammer can be used by a blacksmith. All these other weapons that we use are derived from tools. So a sword is exclusively a combat weapon, which builds on that idea of status and who's wielding the sword. So throughout history, we've seen swords as, culturally, swords have been these symbols of authority and power and war fighting ability. And Tolkien picked that up and created his elven swords and created Aragon's sword Narsil, that gets reforged and all that kind of thing. It's all drawn from the same history. That's why we like swords so much. But I think modern fantasy maybe is a bit too attached to that heritage, and it'd be nice to see some different. I do it myself. My hero has a sword in one of my books, and magical sword, of course. But I think it would be interesting to see a more variety of weapons in fantasy getting their 15 minutes of fame.
Yeah, I don't tend to use swords. I go for more for spears. Use bill hooks in this one. Swords do crop up because they're common, aren't they? Axes as well. Axes, you probably use axes more in this one. I do quite like Vikings, so that's why bit of a Viking background in the family, maybe. So yeah, do quite like axes. But yeah, it's just whatever you prefer, isn't it? Whatever works for you. Make up your own weapon. It doesn't really matter as long as it works. The key point in going over these things, discussing history, is so that you understand how they work in practice, and then you can sort of twist that any way you want, add a magical elements. And I mean, it's fantasy at the end of the day. If anyone questions your use of weapons, you can just turn around and say it's a fantasy. You don't have to explain.
Just needs to be a little bit logical. But
Yeah.
other than that, yeah.
One thing I wanted to mention just before we moved on from weapons was shields, because technically shield is a weapon. You could kill someone with a shield.
Yeah, I'd say it's kind of middle ground. I would say it's both.
Yeah, so it's a good one to bridge the gap between weapons and armor. But shields, like if you think about the role they play, like unbelievable. Most of them are just made from wood, just defending you against all kinds of murderous blades, and wrapped in hides like just wet animal hides. That's what it was. Wrapped. They were often wrapped around like, and there's all different shapes, round shields, more rectangular shields. The Romans used them. But what do you think, Jam? Shields in fantasy?
If you're Yeah, I mean, if you're fighting in if you've got people fighting in melee, I mean, why wouldn't they have shields? It's weird. It's weird to see the battles where you have a hero with a one-handed sword, and then that's all they're using, and they're just kind of using it one-handed, and their other hand is just like hanging out, not doing anything. Why
Yeah,
wouldn't you have a shield or a buckler or some sort of use for that other arm?
yeah. But they wear heavy shields, so I mean, you do have to hold on to that a lot. I mean, the ancient Greeks, I mentioned the phalanx before, it was all based on the spear and the shield wall just locked in. Vikings, shield wall. It's an effective tool. If you just build like the Roman hedgehog, it's just all built with shields. And from a defensive perspective, especially if you're coming up against archers, if you just get into hedgehog formation, which is basically like a shield, a shell made of shields, there's a good chance that you're all going to survive, and you can move. You can move closer to attack. You can flee if you need to. Shields are really, really important, and I don't really think they do get used enough in fantasy. I think the last time I came across it, and it was done quite well, Nicholas Eames' book Kings of the Wild, and that's all based on different characters who each have a particular weapon. So a shield is one for one character. I can't remember what it was, a while ago since I read it now. And swords another axe. And it's actually it's quite cool what he's done because he's based them all on like rock bands. So each weapon represents an instrument in the band. So the shield is the bass guitar, I believe. Um,
I did not know
so
that about that book.
yeah, it's really cool. So it's like if you've never heard of it, it's called Kings of the Wild, and they Kings of the Wild were like a band of mercenaries, but they're treated like rock stars. So like the bands are actually like meant like modeled on bands as we idolize in real life, with like bands of mercenaries, but they're like sort of all retired now, and they were like the best band of mercenaries ever, the Kings of the Wild, and they get the band back together for one last gig, I think. Yeah, I think it's inspired me a lot with my writing. It's not to take it so seriously, and there are parts in your stories. You're talking about death and things like that, killing people, and there are times that you can make it funny. It doesn't all have to be doom and gloom. And
As we move into talking about armor, we can talk about compositions, right? So you can have shields can be made. So shields and armor, like you have different materials you can make them from: wood, leather, hide, and metal. And really, I mean, those serve different things, right? For a shield, a wood shield is just easy to build. It's not going to last too long getting beat upon. Leather, leather armor is more about deflecting blows than absorbing blows or blocking, piercing strikes, right? uh if you're wearing slick leather, it just keeps like a bladed weapon from being able to bite in and get a bite. It just slips off. Is more what leather is typically used for. And then metal, especially like plate armor, is supposed to just absorb that blow, or at least uh keep it from penetrating. What do you think, Richie? What are the different types of armor that you think about, and their role kind of in fantasy?
yeah, I always naturally when I think medieval times just go to the knight. It's the knight is almost synonymous with the medieval period, and it all came about. I love how the sort of plated armor thing came about because it's coming up with ways to not die, essentially, getting killed by all these nasty blades. So
It's
how
an
are we going
arm.
to
It's
stop
an
them?
arms race, right? Essentially.
In arms race, yeah,
Yeah.
between weapons and armor, essentially.
Yeah.
And obviously, we see early forms of sort of clothes that you'd wear in battle. You just have tunics, things like that, furs. Then you get leather. Then you start to see experiments with chainmail and maybe plates of armor, but very small plates of armor that were sewn into leather pieces of armor, just to create like scale effect. Which scaled armor would be quite good for deflecting blows. Um, but yeah, just about chainmail as well. One of the benefits of chainmail is that it was quite easy to make, and it was readily available to a lot of people, and it fit a lot of people as well. Like Blade's Army had to measure people up, so it had to be made to measure. Chainmail, you could just stick a shirt on somebody, and there was a bit of give to it, so it might fit, it might not, but it'd work. That's the main thing. So it was flexible and it was lightweight. So particularly down the line, you'd often see people wearing combinations of different armor. So gambesons, which were like padded tunics, which were good for sort of blunt weapons like maces and things like that. Then you'd wear like a coat of chainmail over that, and then people might even wear plated armor on top. You just giving yourself as much coverage as possible, which is the ultimate end game, I suppose, when it was trying to stay alive on a battlefield. Um,
And then there's other combinations just within the external suit, right? So if you can't get a full suit of plate mail, then you might have a breastplate and then chainmail for the arms and legs, or you might have a breastplate and plate for the main body of your legs and your arms, and then chainmail covering the flexible points or the leftovers, right?
Most definitely, yeah. And another common one you see is sort of over the head, going down to the shoulders, so like a coif. Um, and that'll be quite good. We were talking about before, if you got a plated armor on, there's the weak spot at the neck, so a bit of chainmail there to cover that weak spot is going to help massively. It's late, sort of towards the end of the medieval period that you start to see plated armor, like the sort of walking tanks of knights. And the reason why it looks so clunky and rigid is because you're trying to cover any sort of gap that a blade could get through. So, as if you had a sword, for example, we mentioned this earlier, coming up against someone completely clad in head to toe in armor, a plated armor, how are you going to kill them? So you can't really. If you swipe at them and hit them in the chest with your blade, there's a good chance your sword's going to get stuck. Then they've got a free go at you. The only really way you could do any damage would be to look for the weak points. So the joints were the weak points, because there was always there was never going to be able to cover every point. So behind the knees, that's quite a good one. Always less defended. The
Armpit.
neck, armpit, neck. Next a good one, because you can deal a killing blow there as well. Some modifications of armor even had like raised pieces around the neck to sort of defend from that sort of weak point. My favorite one, my go-to one in my stories, when I like to introduce a bit of drama, is the groin, because that was always undefended for some reason. So little dagger in the groin, that's always a good one to put in. So yeah, it was that's what it was like, and it was really difficult to be a knight, I'd say, because you had to wear this visor. You couldn't really see what was going on, couldn't really hear what was going on, but no one
The
could really.
alternative to sticking a blade in a joint somewhere is just to take a heavy hammer and to dent
Yeah,
the armor and cause damage
cave
that
in.
way.
Yes,
You cave in their chest plate, you're going to cave in their chest.
yeah, just hemorrhaging, causing internal hemorrhaging, or I mean, crushed the helmet, like you crushing skull before you know it. So it was nasty business. But plated armor, yeah, definitely. And if you think about specific types of armor, it's well worth going and having a research of like the anatomy and of armor. I mean, I've got guides on my website, which we'll put the link to. We've got guides to archery, weapons, and armor. So one of my favorite pieces of armor, anyway, is the helmet, because there's so many cool variations of helmets. Decorative, some quite intimidating, um, some just look amazing. And I always loved helmets when we were playing like the older schools games, Skyrim, things like that. But yeah, what do you think
It's
about helmets?
probably one of the most kind of iconic and uh, expressive piece of the full suit of armor, right? That's where a
Yeah,
lot of the artistic expression and creativity of the designer will come out, is in the helmet, in the design of the helmet.
yeah, definitely. I think when you're writing designing these things, you've always got to think about the practicality of using them. So is it going to be, if you're having a tiny visor, how uh, whoever's going to be in that helmet's going to see? How are they going to communicate and get around the battlefield? There's always going to be impacts, like sort of consequences to your designs, and it's all always good to weigh up the sort of pros and cons of different designs and introduce them. So if there's limitations to what you've created, include that in your story, because that adds conflict and a sense of drama. It builds tension. Like if the reader knows that there's a flaw in a piece of armor, then that's playing on the back of their minds, that they know there's that weak point. So there's a chance that they could get hurt. Characters could get hurt. So yeah, little things like that, really good to do.
Moving on to our last little topic for today, we've talked about weapons, we've talked about armor, and typically what we're talking about is something made from metal, right? So, um, some things to keep in mind when you're talking about weapons and armor and metal is there's different types of metal. So, depending on the period that your story takes place, um, earliest metal weapons were made out of copper, and then they started. Uh, we developed alloys such as bronze, and then you moved into iron, and then finally steel. And the type of metal, plays an important role because copper is light, but it's weak. Iron is stronger, but it's very heavy. Steel is the sweet spot where you're lighter, but you've got a lot more um, strength because of steel as a carbonized alloy of iron, and also with the technology of forging, especially when you get to steel. So like copper and bronze, usually the forging was just pour the molten the low melting temperature of those metals meant you could just pour it into a mold. So a lot of like um, bronze spearheads were just molded. They weren't actually the idea that the image we have of the blacksmith and in the forge and the hammer and all that work that goes into hammering a piece of metal, that didn't happen with the lighter metals because they had such a low melting point. You just pour it into a mold and you're done. Whereas when you get to iron and steel, you actually had to have somebody spending a lot of time and energy um, pounding that metal into shape, just because you couldn't get it to a temperature where it melted down purely. You could get it red hot, but you couldn't melt it into a liquid that you could pour into a mold. And then that brought around different technologies in forging, like the carbon alloys that created steel, and layering. So when you take a piece of steel and for example, you fold it, such as in the Japanese tradition, you fold it into you create multiple layers, and the more layers you have, the stronger that piece of metal is going to be. Or you mix in different types of metals together, and you get what sometimes called the Damascus. That blend of different metals and different alloys creates a greater strength than you would have from a single piece of solid steel. And a lot of this I've learned from a show called Forged in Fire. Have you ever seen that show, Richie?
No, I've never seen it.
So it's the only good reality TV show. It's basically a reality competition show where four blacksmiths compete in making knives and weapons. And I used to watch this show a lot on the History Channel. I haven't been able to watch it; hasn't come on recently, but in the early, like the first couple seasons, it was brand new, and it was all amateur hour, and they were just going through the basics of forging and the processes and the types of metals and all these different things that come out. It's very, very informative. But then the other good thing that you can learn a lot by watching Forged in Fire is that every single episode, the final competition between the last two contestants, they have to recreate an actual historical weapon, something that was real. That's it. You know, they go to a museum and they find something and they'd be like, okay, this was this weird hooked sword from a African tribe, and you're gonna make it now, and you're gonna forge it, and then they test these weapons. So you get a a certified weapon master who takes up these weird looking medieval weapons, and he shows you how they would actually he attacks a ballistic dummy. So he fights with a humanoid figure and shows you exactly how these weapons would be used. So if you want to learn about interesting medieval weapons and how they are actually used and how they're created, it's a really good resource watching Forged in Fire.
Sounds awesome, man. So I think that's a good place to finish there. We've covered weapons, we've covered armor, we've covered a lot of ground, I think. Giving you lots of ideas of how to kill people in your stories, which is a little bit murderous. But hope you found it useful anyway. So next time we're going to talk more about how as writers we can include these details in our stories. So there's lots of different ways we could do that. So battle scenes, big one, any kind of conflict scenes. It's always important to know how weapons work in practice, and particularly when we're talking about castles, like fortifications, sieges, how the sort of practicalities they work in practice.
I think looking at the next episode, what I'll talk about is writing those immediate small scale fight scenes, and talk about things like pacing and how you can use sentence structure to create flow and pacing and timing. And I think you'll have a lot more to say on the larger scale battles and things like sieges and castle warfare and all that kind of thing. And then hopefully we put that all together into a good package. And then, of course, as we said, the top of the hour going on now. If you want to sign up for our newsletter and be eligible for multiple giveaways and all sorts of free goodies, just visit our website. That's ofmetalandmagicpublishing.wordpress.com. Sign up for our newsletter. We've got 2 giveaways that are we're gonna call them next month, and a bunch of other release news, sales, all sorts of things. So follow us and for the most recent updates.
Yeah. Thanks very much for listening, everyone. It's been good to kick off the new year with a bit of fantasy. We look forward to the next episode. As always, if you enjoyed this, please follow, please subscribe. If you've got any questions, drop us an email. Any comments at all, get in touch with us. We'd love to hear from you. And if there's anything you want us to cover, just let us know and we'll do our best to include it. So until next time, thanks very much.
Yep. Take care, everybody.